Some airlines were doomed before they ever crashed. Their planes were too old. Their books were in the red. Their pilots flew tired. The regulators looked the other way, and the warnings stacked up year after year. Then, the warnings ran out. These are the airlines that should not have been flying. Subscribe to Terra Obscura. The flight that crashed at Kathmandu on July 24, 2024, was not supposed to have passengers. It was a ferry flight. The aircraft was a Bombardier CRJ-200 operated by Saurya Airlines, the smallest carrier in Nepal. It had sat at Tribhuvan International Airport for 34 days, while paperwork was sorted out for a landing gear overhaul. Now it was being repositioned to Obscura for heavy maintenance. A ferry flight may carry only essential flight crew. That meant 2 pilots. Saurya Airlines put 19 people on board. Most were maintenance engineers. Others included the airline's chief of operations, who was also the captain, the chief of safety, the chief of quality assurance, the head of maintenance, the head of continuing airworthiness, and an off-duty pilot. 2 people were not Saurya employees at all. They were the wife and 4-year-old child of a staff member. The cargo was also illegal. Maintenance gear filled the cargo bay, and the rest was placed on passenger seats with no restraints. Among the items were flammable lubricants, hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and cleaning solvents. Saurya Airlines was not certified to carry hazardous materials. The ground staff had no cargo licenses. The pilots were in the cockpit while this was happening and did not object. In the front of the airplane, First Officer Sushant Katwal was running through the takeoff numbers. He was 26 and had been flying for Saurya for 5 years. He was under financial pressure after training costs, salary deductions, and unpaid furlough during the pandemic. There was essentially no chance he would have refused this flight. The captain was Manish Shakya, 35 years old, and also the chief of operations for the airline. He arrived 20 minutes before takeoff, gave general instructions, then began chatting with passengers about Obscura and the upcoming maintenance check. He did not cross-check the takeoff speed calculations, even though he was required to. Neither pilot knew that the speed card Katawal had used was wrong. When Saurya Airlines created its speed cards in 2014, someone copied the numbers from the 17,500 kilogram weight card into the 18,500 kilogram card without changing them. No one caught the error in 10 years. That card was rarely used, but on this morning, the airplane fell exactly into that weight range. The card showed a rotation speed of 118 knots. The correct safe speed was 122 knots. The pilots would rotate 4 knots too early. There was another problem. Captain Shakya had a habit of pulling back hard during rotation. So did many other Saurya pilots. Over a year and a half of recorded data, the airline's average rotation rate was much higher than the manufacturer recommended. The 2 fastest rotations on record had both involved Captain Shakya. The airline had a flight data analysis system that was supposed to detect this kind of trend. It was installed. It was never used. At 11:04 in the morning, the CRJ-200 lifted off from runway 02 at Kathmandu. Shakya pulled back on the controls, and the nose rose at 6.5 degrees per second. It was the fastest rotation Saurya Airlines had ever recorded. The airplane became airborne only 11 feet above the runway. The wings were already near a stall. The captain continued to pitch up. The right wing dropped first. The airplane rolled 25 degrees to the right at very low altitude. Shakya moved the controls left. He overcorrected. The airplane rolled 55 degrees to the left. He moved the controls right again, and the airplane rolled back until the wings were almost vertical, with the right wing pointing toward the ground. Then the stick pusher fired. It was designed to push the controls forward automatically during a stall. Shakya pulled against it with all his strength. 13 seconds after liftoff, the CRJ-200 came down off the right side of the runway. The right wingtip struck a taxiway. The wing exploded. The airplane cartwheeled into a shed and a shipping container belonging to a local helicopter company. The cockpit separated from the cabin and became embedded in the shipping container. The fuselage continued over an embankment into a construction site below the airport, where it caught fire. Inside the cabin, the unrestrained cargo made the fire worse. Hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and other flammable materials had already spread through the aircraft. The fire reached the interior within seconds. 18 people died. Among them were the chief of safety, the chief of quality assurance, the head of maintenance, and the head of continuing airworthiness. The people responsible for keeping Saurya Airlines compliant with aviation rules died on a flight that had broken several of those rules before it even left the ground. The only survivor was Captain Manish Shakya. He was pulled from the wreckage of the cockpit before the fire reached him. A day after the accident, Saurya Airlines voluntarily suspended operations. Nepal's aviation authority later revoked the airline's license. Most of the people who ran the airline were dead, and the company had only one airplane left. This was not just a failed takeoff, it was a small airline's safety system collapsing in 13 seconds. Air was founded in 2002 by a businesswoman named Saurya Airlines and the Speaker of Indonesia's House of Representatives. It was named for Aang's son. He was 26 years old, and they made him CEO. The airline grew at a frightening pace. Within 4 years, it had 25 Boeing 737s. It marketed 15-year-old jets as new. Its logo was a silhouette of Icarus, the man who flew too close to the sun. Behind the marketing, the airline was rotting from the inside. Pilots were forced to fly aircraft that were not legally airworthy. They were told to sign off on maintenance logs that no engineer had ever seen. Faulty parts were swapped between airplanes to reset the repair clocks. According to a former pilot, every flight at Air began with a fight on the ground about which regulations the crew would be forced to violate. One of the airline's 737s, 18 years old, had a serious problem with its inertial reference system. The system is what tells the pilots where the airplane is. There are 2 of them in the cockpit, one for each pilot. On this airplane, the 2 had been disagreeing about the airplane's position for months. Pilots had written it up in the maintenance log more than 100 times in the last 3 months alone. The airline did not have a replacement part. Every time the fault appeared, mechanics would pull the unit, clean the connectors, slot it back in, and clear the write-up. The problem never went away. The airplane kept flying. On New Year's Day 2007, that airplane was scheduled to operate a flight from Surabaya on Java to Manado on Sulawesi. The flight number was 574. There were 96 passengers and 6 crew on board. The captain was Refri Widodo. The first officer was Yoga Susanto. Both knew about the airplane's history with the inertial reference system. Both of them flew it anyway. The flight took off at 2 in the afternoon, headed northeast across the Makassar Strait. Almost immediately, the 2 systems began to disagree. The autopilot was following one of them. The other was telling the pilots that the airplane was 28 nautical miles away from where the autopilot thought it was. One was right and one was wrong, and the pilots did not know which. By 2:40 in the afternoon, they were lost. Air traffic controllers in Makassar watched the airplane drift north of its route. One of them exclaimed aloud that Adam was flying north when he should have been flying east. The pilots, surrounded by a thunderstorm building over the strait, ignored the call to turn back and kept trying to fix the navigation problem. For half an hour, both pilots focused entirely on the troubleshooting. Neither paid attention to where the airplane was going. The quick reference handbook on board contained an emergency procedure for the fault. The pilots had never been trained on this procedure. Air did not include it in any of its training programs. When they finally located the procedure and switched the first officer's system, the autopilot disconnected. An alarm sounded. Someone in the cockpit reached over and silenced the alarm without saying anything. Neither pilot acknowledged out loud that the airplane was now being flown by no one. The airplane had a tendency to roll slightly to the right. The autopilot had been correcting this for the entire flight. Now it stopped. The airplane began to roll right, 1 degree per second. Captain Widodo did not notice. He was looking down at the instruments. By the time the bank angle warning began to sound, the airplane was tilted 35 degrees to the right. The captain made a small input. Then he went back to the instruments. The airplane continued to roll. The wings passed the vertical. The airplane turned upside down. Now inverted. With the wings no longer holding it up, the airplane began to dive. The captain pulled back hard on the control column. In an inverted airplane, pulling back is a command to dive harder. They went straight down through the storm at nearly 900 kilometers per hour. The horizontal stabilizer ripped off. The fuselage began to come apart. At 9,000 feet, the flight recorders stopped. What happened in the cabin during the descent is not known. The wreckage lay under 2,000 meters of water, and nothing was ever recovered, except the black boxes themselves. For 6 months after the crash, the recorders sat on the floor of the Makassar Strait. Air refused to pay for their recovery. They argued that if the Indonesian government wanted the boxes brought up, the government could pay for it. The families of the dead waited. After 7 months, the airline finally agreed to pay half the cost of a 1-week search. The recorders were found within 5 days. In 2008, Air lost its operating certificate. Later that same year, Saurya Airlines was arrested by Indonesian police. She was charged with embezzling over $200 million from her own airline. Investigators alleged that Air had been a criminal enterprise from its first day of operation. The Speaker of the House had been brought into the business not for his money, but for his political position, which he used to make sure the regulators looked the other way. 1-2-Go was the budget arm of an airline called Orient Thai. Orient Thai had been flying for more than a decade by the early 2000s, mostly on international charter routes. One2Go was founded in 2003 to carry tourists between Bangkok and the beach resorts of southern Thailand. At first it did well. Then in December of 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck the coast of Thailand. Tourism collapsed. The airline never financially recovered. By 2007, Orient Thai and One2Go had become a single shared organization, run on the cheap by Thantipprasongchai, a man close to the Thai royal family. The cost-cutting reached the cockpit. Pilots were paid cash bonuses for flying past their legal duty time limits. Pilots who refused to fly broken aircraft were replaced by pilots who would. Former employees said the chairman personally called captains and ordered them to fly aircraft that were not airworthy. Training was also dangerously weak. Pilots trained inside the airline received almost no instruction in crew coordination. New first officers were released onto passenger flights with far fewer hours than were standard at other airlines. On the 16th of September, 2007, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 flying for One2Go began its descent into Phuket. The flight number was 269. There were 123 passengers on board from at least 13 countries. The captain was Arif Mulyadi. He had 16,000 hours of flying experience, but among the airline's pilots, he was known for freezing during difficult approaches or bad weather. Other captains had warned new first officers not to expect help from him in an emergency. His first officer was Montri Kamaratanachai. He had 1,400 hours total, all of it with One2Go. He had been trained in-house. His common language with the captain was English, which neither of them spoke very well. Both pilots had been working past their legal duty limits for months. The first officer had exceeded his monthly flight limits and received less than the required rest period several times. Each time, he received a cash bonus from the airline. After the accident, the airline gave investigators duty records showing both pilots had followed the rules. The records were forgeries. Real ones were later obtained by an Australian television station. A heavy thunderstorm was sitting over Phuket Airport when the airplane began its approach. The tower reported wind of 15 knots, then 30 knots, then 40 knots. Heavy rain began to fall. Visibility dropped. The first officer was flying. The captain was on the radios. Passing 200 feet above the runway, the airplane was hit by a downdraft. It began to descend at more than twice the normal rate. The captain called for more power. The first officer pushed the throttle levers forward, but the descent did not slow. The ground proximity warning system called out. The first officer realized they could not land safely. He called for a go-around and pushed the throttles to maximum power, but the auto throttle was still set to retard mode, which reduces the engines to idle before touchdown. When the first officer pushed the throttles forward by hand, he did not cancel the mode by pressing the go-around buttons. The auto throttle was still trying to bring the engines back to idle. As long as the first officer kept his hand on the throttles, the engines stayed at maximum power. Then, in the middle of the go-around, he told the captain to take over. He let go of the throttles. The auto throttle resumed its command. The engines began to spool down toward idle. The airplane climbed to 300 feet, then began to lose altitude. Neither pilot reacted. The ground proximity warning system called out a sink rate. The captain finally realized what was happening, pushed the throttles forward, and pulled back on the controls. It was too late. Flight 269 struck the ground just to the right of the runway. The airplane crossed a drainage ditch and slammed into an earthen embankment. The forward fuselage peeled open. The fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. 90 people died. The captain and the first officer both survived the impact, but died in the fire. The airport had no emergency response plan. Fire trucks could not cross the drainage ditch and had to spray water from a distance. Only one ambulance and one medical crew responded. Many survivors waited for medical care. When investigators looked into the airline, they found the false duty records were only part of the problem. One2Go's training program for the MD-82 had never been certified by Thai regulators. The airline had no quality assurance program. The company had no real management structure. Orient Thai employees were running the airline as a side job. The European Union banned Orient Thai from its airports. The Thai Aviation Authority grounded both airlines for 56 days. France issued an international arrest warrant for Thantipprasongchai. He was convicted in absentia and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was never extradited. He continued to live in Bangkok until he died in 2021. He was never brought to justice. MK Airlines was a cargo carrier registered in Ghana. By 2004, it operated 12 airplanes, including 6 Boeing 747 freighters. But behind that growth was one of the most exhausting work cultures in commercial aviation. The official maximum duty period for a 747 crew at the airline was 24 hours. Even that was unusually high. But investigators later found that most MK Airlines duty periods went beyond 24 hours. Pilots, engineers, and loadmasters were expected to stay on duty for as long as the company needed them. Loadmasters had no duty limits at all. On October 13, 2004, a crew was assigned to fly 4 sectors in one duty shift. Luxembourg to Bradley Airport in Connecticut, Bradley to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Halifax to Zaragoza, Spain, then back to Luxembourg. The scheduled duty period was already 24 hours and 30 minutes, longer than the airline's own rules allowed. Then everything was delayed. The airplane arrived late from Johannesburg. Cargo was overloaded and had to be partly removed. Some pallets were contaminated with dirt and had to be cleaned before customs would accept them. The flight finally left Luxembourg 6 hours late. Before boarding, Captain David Lamb wrote a complaint to the company. He noted that the duty period was already over the limit before the day even began. It was the last document he ever submitted to the airline. The flight to Bradley took 7 hours. After landing, 2 of the pilots were replaced. First Officer Gary Keogh stayed on board. He had already been on duty for more than 14 hours. The next flight, from Bradley to Halifax, was uneventful. In Halifax, the aircraft was loaded with 13 tons of frozen lobsters and enough fuel for the transatlantic crossing to Spain. Now somebody had to calculate the takeoff numbers. The 747 had a Windows laptop behind the cockpit. It ran a program called the Boeing Laptop Tool. The program gave the pilots the speeds and engine power settings needed for takeoff. Earlier that year, MK Airlines had switched from paper tables to this software, but the crews had received almost no formal training on how to use it. The program had a dangerous flaw. If someone opened a weight and balance pop-up, looked at it, and closed it, the software copied the weight from that pop-up into the main calculation page. The pop-up kept the weight from the previous takeoff. If the user did not change it, the program calculated the new takeoff using the old weight. In Halifax, somebody opened that pop-up and closed it. The weight left inside was from the previous takeoff at Bradley. It was 240 tons. But the airplane now sitting on the runway at Halifax weighed 353 tons. It was 113 tons heavier. The laptop calculated takeoff numbers for the wrong weight. Those numbers were written on a paper takeoff card and given to the pilots. The card listed a rotation speed of 129 knots. The actual safe rotation speed was 162 knots. The card also gave a reduced engine power setting, used for lighter airplanes. At its real weight, the airplane needed full takeoff power. There were checks that should have caught the error. The captain was supposed to verify the calculation. The pilots were supposed to compare the numbers with a backup table. Neither check was done. At 3 in the morning, the 747 taxied onto the runway. The pilots pushed the throttles forward to a power setting meant for an airplane 113 tons lighter. The airplane rolled down the runway. It did not accelerate as expected. When it reached the rotation speed written on the card, the flying pilot pulled back on the controls. The nose came up. The wheels did not. At the airplane's real weight, 129 knots was not enough to fly. The 747 continued down the runway with its nose raised and its main landing gear still on the ground. The pilot pulled harder. The tail struck the runway and dragged along the pavement, throwing sparks behind it. The pilot finally pushed the throttles to full power, but it was too late. The airplane ran off the end of the runway. Beyond the runway was an earthen berm built to raise the instrument landing system antenna. The tail of the 747 struck the berm at takeoff speed. The entire tail section was ripped away. For a moment, the forward fuselage stayed in the air. Without a tail, it was uncontrollable. It pitched down and slammed into the forest beyond the runway. The fuel tanks ruptured and the airplane caught fire. All 7 crew members were killed instantly. Canadian investigators arrived within the day. The cockpit voice recorder had been destroyed. The flight data recorder survived. It showed that the flying pilots had been on duty for 19 hours at the moment of the crash. The loadmaster and ground engineer had been on duty for 45.5 hours. MK Airlines went bankrupt 6 years later. Ghana's Aviation Authority was later criticized for failing to properly oversee the airline. Investigators concluded that the pilots had not made a complicated calculation error. They had made the kind of mistake a tired person makes at 3 in the morning, after nearly 20 hours awake. They looked at a number on a screen, wrote it down, and trusted that it was right. Manx2 was not an airline. It sold tickets, painted its logo on small commuter airplanes, and advertised flights between cities in the United Kingdom and Ireland. But it owned no airplanes. It employed no pilots. It had no air operator certificate, no maintenance staff, and no real operations department. It was a brand sitting on top of a structure made from other companies. The airplane that crashed in Cork on February 10, 2011, was owned by a Spanish bank. It was leased to Air Lada, then subleased to Flightline, which held the operating certificate. Manx2 sold the seats. Flightline operated the airplane. Airlata arranged the operation in between. The pilots were employed by Airlata but trained by Flightline. Maintenance was done by another company. At night, the same airplane flew cargo for the Royal Mail under a separate contract. The Spanish Aviation Authority, which was supposed to oversee Flightline, did not know the full operation existed. It did not know the airplane was being operated in the British Isles. It did not know about Manx2 or the cargo flights. Airlata, the company running much of the operation day-to-day, was not registered as an airline anywhere. This was the arrangement that flew passengers between Belfast and Cork twice a day. On the morning of February 10th, the airplane was a Fairchild Metroliner, a small twin-engine commuter. There were 10 passengers and 2 pilots on board. The captain was Jordi Sola Lopez. He was Spanish, with around 1,800 total flying hours, low for a captain. He had been flying as captain without supervision for only 4 days. The first officer was Andrew Cantle. He was English, with 539 hours total. He had been hired barely more than a week earlier and had just come out of training. He had not completed all the line checks required by law and was supposed to be flying with a training captain. The airline scheduled him on regular flights anyway. The airplane flew cargo at night. In the morning, the pilots had to reinstall the passenger seats themselves. Neither pilot was certified to do that work. The first officer also loaded the passengers' bags, because there was no baggage handler in Belfast. The flight took off at 8:10 in the morning, headed for Cork. By the time it arrived, fog had covered Cork Airport. Visibility was below the legal minimum to land. The pilots tried anyway. They flew the approach to runway 17, descended below the legal minimum altitude without seeing the runway, and gave up at 101 feet. They climbed away, circled around, and tried the same runway from the opposite direction. They descended through the minimum again and gave up at 91 feet. The visibility was still poor. They entered a holding pattern. The first officer suggested diverting to Kerry, where the weather was clear. Then another pilot asked for the Cork visibility. The controller gave a slightly improved number. Lopez and Cantle decided to try a third approach. A third approach in poor weather is dangerous because the pressure to land begins to replace the pressure to be safe. But there was no rule stopping them. The airplane also had a known problem. The right engine had a faulty temperature sensor. It made the engine run slightly faster than the left one at the same throttle setting. To balance the thrust, the pilots had to keep the throttle levers staggered. The right throttle stayed slightly back. The left stayed slightly forward. On the third approach, the captain decided to help his exhausted first officer by taking over the throttles. The first officer kept flying. To reduce thrust, the captain pulled both throttles back together. The right throttle stopped at flight idle, but the left throttle, which had been further forward, traveled past flight idle into the beta range. The beta range is where propeller pitch moves toward reverse thrust. The captain had accidentally put the left engine into reverse. The airplane began to roll hard to the left. The captain called for a go-around. The first officer pulled back on the controls. The captain pushed both throttles forward to maximum power, but forgot to keep them staggered. The left engine now produced more thrust than the faulty right engine. The airplane rolled past level. The right wing dropped. The Metroliner banked more than 90 degrees to the right at very low altitude. The right wingtip struck the runway. The airplane rolled inverted, came down on its back, and slid off the runway onto the grass. Both pilots were killed instantly. 4 of the 10 passengers in the front rows were killed with them. 6 passengers in the back survived. Firefighters had to cut into the airplane through the baggage compartment because every door was crushed shut. Ireland had not had a fatal commercial airline accident since 1968. It was the worst crash on Irish soil in over 40 years. When investigators looked into the airline, they found that the airline did not really exist. They found a Spanish bank, Airlata, Flightline, Manx2, a maintenance company, Royal Mail, and contracts linking one company to another, but they could not find a real airline. Airlata kept operating after the crash. Flightline was banned from flying the Fairchild Metroliner. Manx2 went out of business the following year. Its assets were bought by another company, and the same flights resumed. The crash happened because 2 pilots who should not have been flying together were paired on an airplane with a known mechanical fault on a third approach into fog by an airline that was not an airline, overseen by a regulator that did not know it existed. Merpati Nusantara was the second state-owned airline of Indonesia. Its job was to fly to the parts of the country that no commercial airline wanted to serve. For decades, Merpati flew old, mismatched aircraft into ports made of mud and grass in some of the most dangerous flying weather on Earth. It crashed often. By 2011, the airline had had 20 fatal accidents in its history. The 21st was about to happen. By 2010, the airline owed 1.5 trillion rupiahs to its creditors. mostly to the state oil company for unpaid fuel bills. The same year, the airline placed an order for 15 new airplanes from China. The aircraft was the Jian Ma-60, a Chinese twin-engine turboprop modeled on a Soviet design from the 1950s. It had never been operated in Indonesia before. It had never been certified by any major international aviation authority. Its safety record was the worst of any Chinese passenger airliner. There were no qualified maintenance facilities or training centers for it anywhere in Indonesia. Merpati bought them anyway. The entire cost would be covered by a low-interest loan from the Export-Import Bank of China. The airline did not pay for the airplanes. Indonesian taxpayers did. When the first airplanes arrived, inspectors found cracks in their vertical stabilizers that had to be repaired before the planes could enter service. Indonesian newspapers later reported that the price Merpati paid for each airplane was several $1 million higher than the market rate. The difference, anti-corruption activists said, had been funneled through a shell company into the pockets of unnamed government officials. Indonesia's Attorney General opened an investigation. The investigation went nowhere. Pilots who had spent their careers flying Western airplanes were transferred to the new fleet with almost no notice. They were sent to a simulator in China to train with instructors who did not speak their language. They came back after a few dozen hours. One of them was Captain Purwandi Wahyu. He was 55 years old. He had 24,000 hours of total flying experience, almost all of it on Western jets. He had 199 hours on the new aircraft. His first officer that day was Paul Knapp. He was 36. He had 370 hours total across all aircraft types. He was a complete newcomer to aviation, placed directly onto the new aircraft after finishing training. On the 7th of May 2011, the two pilots were flying a series of short hops around the eastern provinces. There were 19 passengers and 6 crew on board. The flight number was 8968. The destination was Kaimana, a village on the southwest coast of West Papua. Its single-runway airport had no instrument approach procedures and no navigation aids. The only way to land there was visually. By the time the airplane was on final approach, visibility had fallen to 2 kilometers, well below the legal minimum. Captain Wahyu knew it was below minimums. He told his first officer so. Then he told him to continue anyway. The airplane circled south of the field, looking for a gap in the rain. At one point, the captain called for flap setting 25 degrees. The Jian Ma-60 does not have a flap setting at 25 degrees. The Fokker 100, which Wahyu had flown for 16 years, does. With less than a minute to go before landing, Wahyu took the controls away from his first officer. Handing the controls back and forth this close to the ground is something pilots are taught never to do. The ground proximity warning system called out that they had reached their minimum descent altitude. They could not see the runway. The captain asked 3 times if his first officer could see it. 3 times the answer was no. At 376 feet, Wahyu decided to abandon the approach. He pushed the throttles forward and pulled the airplane into a climb. The engines did not respond the way he expected. The Jian Ma-60 has an engine setting that the pilots are supposed to select before every approach. The setting tells the engines how much power they are allowed to produce. During the cruise, the airplane runs at a low setting to save fuel. Before approach, the pilots are supposed to switch to the highest allowable so that maximum power is available for a go-around. Neither pilot had pressed the button. The engines were still set to cruise mode. They could only produce 2/3 of their available power. At the same time, the first officer retracted the flaps too soon. The airplane lost lift. The captain began a hard turn to the left to avoid terrain on the right side of the runway. The bank angle reached 38 degrees. The airplane was now climbing at low speed with insufficient power, retracted flaps in a steep bank. It did not climb. 13 seconds after starting the go-around, Merpati Flight 8968 hit the surface of Kaimana Bay and broke into 5 pieces. All 25 people on board died. The investigation found there was nothing mechanically wrong with the airplane. The fault lay with the pilots, who had been trained for only a few weeks on an aircraft they did not understand, flying for an airline that did not enforce procedures, in weather that was below the legal minimums. The Indonesian Ministry of Transportation declined to ground the Ma-60 fleet. The transportation minister stated that Merpati had tried its best. 3 years after the crash, the airline stopped flying. It could not afford to refuel its airplanes. Its pilots had gone 3 months without being paid. 50 of them quit in protest. The remaining airplanes were sent back to China. 2 of them did not return. One was at the bottom of Kaimana Bay. The other had crashed in 2013 when a pilot accidentally put the propellers into reverse while still in the air. All of the flights in this video had passenger manifests. All of the passengers had names. They had families, friends, and people waiting for them at the other end of the journey. They bought tickets from companies that called themselves airlines. They arrived at airports with control towers. runway lights, security checks, boarding gates, safety cards, and uniforms. To an ordinary passenger, everything looked normal. That was the most dangerous part. The people on board had no way of seeing what was behind the ticket. They could not read internal audits. They could not inspect maintenance records. They could not know that a crew had been awake for 20 hours, or 30 hours, or 45.5 hours. They could not know that training had been skipped, that manuals had been copied from other airlines, that certificates had been forged, or that regulators had approved companies they barely understood. They trusted the system because that is what passengers are supposed to do. And usually, that trust is justified. Modern aviation is built on layers of protection. The airline checks the aircraft. The pilots trust their training. The mechanics trust their procedures. The regulators trust their inspections. International organizations trust national authorities. Every link depends on the one before it. But in these cases, the links had already broken. The warning signs were not hidden. They were visible long before the crashes. Unpaid pilots, missing training, exhausted crews, broken maintenance systems, overloaded aircraft, false records, weak regulators. Companies that sold tickets like airlines, but did not behave like airlines. By the time passengers walked through the gate, the danger was already built into the flight. After the crashes, some of these airlines disappeared. Some were grounded. Some lost their certificates. Some went bankrupt. Some changed names or continued under different structures. In a few cases, people were prosecuted. In others, the people responsible died comfortably, avoided extradition, or never faced a courtroom at all. That is what makes these accidents so disturbing. They were not just failures of pilots, machines, or weather. They were failures of oversight, failures of responsibility, failures that had been allowed to continue until passengers paid the price. Flying is safe because the system is supposed to notice when something is wrong. But when everyone assumes someone else is checking, sometimes nobody is. And when that happens, an airplane can look normal from the gate, sound normal on the runway, and still be part of a system that has already failed. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Terra Obscura. More aviation documentaries are coming soon.